Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. A little over a week ago, voters in Turkey participated in nationwide local elections. The opposition made significant gains against President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Justice and Development Party, and maintained power in 4 of the country's largest cities, Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, and Antalya, and took control of a 5th city, Bursa, as well as a number of smaller cities. The strong showing of support for Istanbul's mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, solidified his position as the main opposition leader and might, in fact, reinvigorate the anti-Erdogan opposition. Many Turks believe that he, İmamoğlu, is a potential contender in the next presidential election, which is slated to take place in 2028, and when he could, in fact, face off against Mr. Erdogan. The atmosphere has been driven by voter resentment about inflation and about the economy. And today, to help us understand the shift away from Erdogan, as well as the impact that these local elections have had, we're joined by 2 experts. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Sinem Adar from the Center for Applied Turkey Studies at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, known to many people as Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, or SWP. Sinem, herzlich willkommen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And also with us, based in Ankara, is Friederike Böge. She is a foreign correspondent for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and she reports on Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Friederike, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you for having me.
So in the run-up to the election, there seemed to be a sense of disenchantment across Turkey. Economic concerns were a significant driver of this disenchantment following a major devaluation of the lira and high inflation rates. How would each of you describe the mood prior to the election? Friederike, maybe we can start with you, since you're in Turkey and maybe even a little closer to the pulse of what's going on.
Sure. Maybe I should explain that I came to Turkey a year ago, shortly before the presidential election. And if I compare these elections, it's quite interesting to compare them, because when I arrived before the presidential elections, the atmosphere was, full of hope. So many people expected the opposition to win the presidential elections. And then when this did not happen, there was such a strong sense of disillusionment and disappointment that it actually led to a wave of migration almost, or at least so many people talked about, wanting to migrate because they did not see any hope for their country. And then when the local elections approached, there wasn't actually much talk about the election. It felt like nobody didn't care too much. But then when the opposition won this local election, then it almost exploded. Like I went in the evening, even before İmamoğlu had claimed a victory in Istanbul, I went to the town hall here in Ankara, and there were already thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands, waving flags, national flags, not party flags. They were singing the national anthem, and it was a mood as if they had won a national election, and it wasn't like not like a local election in Germany or something. So there was this feeling that this sense of hope is back.
Mm-hmm. And Sinem, from your vantage point, what was the mood like in the run-up to the election, and what were sort of your takeaways from these surprising results?
Everything Friederike said, I think because of the fact that the opposition alliance broke down shortly after the last year's presidential and parliamentary elections, and each and every opposition party decided to field their own candidates, there was actually quite often hesitation and concern that in both Istanbul, particularly in Istanbul, the opposition, the CHP's, the main opposition party's candidate, İmamoğlu particularly, will not be able to win the election. And as Friederike said, there was also, because again, the opposition's defeat in last year's elections, there was quite of a strong disillusionment among the opposition voters that I think spelled doubt on whether the opposition voters would actually go to the ballot box and cast their votes. And as we saw, they did actually. Mostly they did. In a couple of cities, there were some, I think there was a decline in turnout, but the decline in turnout among the AKP voters surprisingly seems to be higher than the decline in turnout among the opposition voters. And last but not least, although the economic situation was not good during last year's elections as well, after the last year's election, you might all know that there was a return to the so-called orthodox policies. And that, I think, kind of made things worse for President Erdogan. So he was not really able to channel resources to its own base, which I think a little bit like actually made the situation open before the elections, that because of the kind of, again, not being able to channel the resources, not necessarily because of the specificities of the economy, but mainly because of the economic policy and its implications on the clientelistic practices that AKP actually thrives on to gain votes. So that was a little bit, I think, that left the outcome a little bit kind of in the middle. And in terms of the takeaways after after Sunday, I mean, of course, it's a big win for the main opposition party, CHP, because after 47 years, they have gained the majority of the votes and they ranked the first party. So that's quite something. And as you rightfully said, they did not only hold on to the metropolitan municipalities that they gained in the 2019 local elections, but they were also able to gain smaller cities in the inner Aegean, in Black Sea, and in the western part of Anatolia. So when you look at the map today, you see that actually the western part of the country, including inner Anatolia, is now colored by red. That is the color of the main opposition party. So that's a big gain. And it basically tells that despite the fragmentation of the opposition parties, the main opposition party was actually able to consolidate the opposition votes. So that's, I think, kind of accentuates the success of the main opposition party. And of course, I think there is also something to say about the Kurdish left-leaning DEM party, because despite now almost 10 years of suppression over their right to political representation, DEM was able to, despite also quite strong decline in the turnout rates in the Kurdish southeast and east, DEM party was able to actually gain a significant number of municipalities in the southeast and east. So that's my second observation about Sunday's elections. And last but not least, the AKP itself not only lost quite a significant number of cities to the main opposition party, but even in its own stronghold cities, it lost significant number of votes. And there, perhaps we will come to this, I think a competitor within the Islamist circle, i.e. the New Welfare Party, it looks like it has actually played a significant role in the decline of the AKP's votes.
So obviously you've both put a lot out there, and I'd like to maybe pick up on a couple of threads and then come back to some of these trends and some of the parties. One of the first things I'd like to ask you about has to do with voter turnout. In one of the reports that I saw, it said that voter turnout was around 76%, which was down from 87% in the presidential elections. And I'm curious what each of you think might have accounted for this decline in voter turnout. Did it have to do with some of the sort of disenchantment that people had that you were talking about, Friederike? Or did it have to do with the fact that these were local elections and not really national elections? I mean, 76% still seems relatively high from a US standard, but it is definitely a drop over the previous year.
Can I?
Sure.
I think it was 79%.
Okay.
But actually, even in local elections, usually the turnout rate is more than 80. I think in the 2019 local elections, it was 84%, if I'm not mistaken. So first of all, this shows that Turkish people take their right to vote very, very seriously. Mm-hmm. Which is a positive news, even despite all, talk about unlevel playing field. I think the reason why it was lower this time is quite interesting because, as Sinem said, usually there is this theory that if the turnout rate is low, then this is bad news for the opposition. But in this case, it seems that AKP voters mainly stayed at home. There is no, as far as I have seen, there is no conclusive analysis exactly who stayed at home, but we can assume that, for example, pensioners were disappointed because they are the most affected by the current high inflation and the fact that their pensions have not been raised accordingly. Mm-hmm. Before the presidential elections, actually Erdogan did quite a lot for pensioners, and this time he abstained from it. And we are hearing some news that actually there were some people within his party who tried to urge him to raise pensions, but he didn't. And also before the elections, of course I spoke to a lot of people, and I felt that in AKP strongholds, there was this sense that people would like to send a lesson or to the AKP, especially since this was just a local election. So they felt that kind of the consequences of this move would not be as in election.
As severe. Yeah, I mean that makes sense, and I mean that brings up another point that I wanted to pick up on, which has to do with how much campaigning Erdogan actually did. I mean, it seemed to me that these were not sort of your average local elections, particularly because Erdogan was actively campaigning for many of his party's candidates across the country. I want to say in one of the reports that I saw, he was in over 50 of the country's 81 different provinces to support AKP candidates. And that sort of made this election into a real referendum of him and his government. I'm curious whether the two of you read anything into his strong engagement in this election and whether he recognized that there was a lot on the line for him personally, but also for his party.
I definitely agree. I think, I mean, he not only Erdogan himself campaigned, but he also made his entire cabinet campaign for the AKP candidates in Istanbul and elsewhere. And also in the Anatolian cities, I think a lot of ministers from Erdogan's cabinet were basically asking for votes for the candidate in Istanbul. So that's also kind of like the reason why I think there was a lot of also emphasis put in the Anatolian cities was that because, of course, Istanbul is a city that has received migration over the decades from each corner of the country. And actually in the rally that Erdogan had in Istanbul, he had an interesting sentence where he asked the participants at the rally to basically, in rallies in the Anatolian cities, that he was asking people to basically call their relatives in Istanbul and ask them to vote for AKP. I think, so in that sense, you are absolutely right, Stephen, that I think in a way, knowingly or unknowingly, Erdogan has turned the election into a national election, because especially in Istanbul, right? Because İmamoğlu was not necessarily competing against the AKP's candidate Murat Kurum, but competing against an entire state apparatus and the media and resources that came with it. And I think two things actually played against the AKP and its candidates, particularly in the metropolitan cities. First of all, in the AKP campaign, I think it was a little bit indecisive in terms of discursively whether to put the emphasis on security issues, i.e. the Kurdish question and the PKK, them, etc., or on local issues. So there was this constant kind of swinging between the two issues. And second, the choice of the candidates looks like it wasn't also the best choice in a lot of cities, first and foremost in Istanbul. So it looks like those two factors played against the AKP and its candidates across the country.
So you've both talked a little bit about the distinction between sort of what goes on in some of the cities and what goes on in more rural areas, and particularly this distinction between Istanbul and Anatolia, where traditionally there have been differences. Sinem, you were talking a little bit earlier about the fact that one's even seeing this trend of sort of growth of opposition in Anatolia. But I'm curious how important Istanbul is as a bellwether, because it's often also thought of as a little bit of an anomaly and doesn't necessarily speak for all of Turkey. So how widely is Istanbul considered to be a microcosm for the country? And why is it such a crucial hotspot in elections like this one?
Well, first of all, because of the migration history that Sinem mentioned, I mean, a fifth of the population in Turkey, or according to different numbers, between a fourth and a fifth of the country live in Istanbul. So you can already see that it's a gravitation center. And then it has a lot of symbolic cultural capital. It is of course, the cultural, it's the old Ottoman Empire's capital. So it is the cultural center of the country. It is also the economic center of the country, which comes with a lot of resources for whoever wins in Istanbul. Whoever is the mayor of Istanbul can also distribute a lot of jobs. And it's a stage, I think, for like the country looks to Istanbul more than to Ankara, I have to admit, although I'm in Ankara. So as a stage, people, if the mayor says something, apart from the fact that, of course, he plays a central role in his party, they will listen more than, they will pay more attention than when Mansur Yavaş, the mayor of Ankara, says something.
If I may,
of course, I think it's important to remember that Istanbul is where Erdogan got his political start as well, and so undoubtedly the symbolism, had he been able to sort of recapture Istanbul from the opposition, could have been significant for him. But Sinem, I did not want to cut you off.
I was actually going to say exactly the same, because even that sentence that whoever wins Istanbul wins Turkey, I think that sentence belongs to Erdogan himself, actually. And of course, that kind of like builds upon his own political history, career history, that he has become, he was first, before becoming basically the prime minister, he was the mayor of Istanbul. And through that, he kind of moved up the ladder, so to speak, in his political career. So I think that in a way kind of also, we talked earlier about how Erdogan himself has turned the local election into a national election, but I think it's also kind of like by positioning Istanbul as such as well, I think the meaning partially is attributed by Erdogan himself, I think, to the city, despite the fact that, of course, there are demographic reasons, economic reasons, etc., why the city is important. And in this particular election, though, I personally think what happened in the inner Aegean, Black Sea, and the Mediterranean cities is not less important than what happened in Istanbul, mainly in the sense that, because if you kind of look at city by city, there is really a very interesting thing going on, in the sense that, for instance, in the inner Aegean, CHP, the main opposition party, was able to gain the votes of the nationalist parties. That's interesting. And again, in Istanbul and in a couple of other cities, it was because of the Kurdish voters that the CHP was able, in a way, kind of, I think what the election results show, again, if you go city by city, is that the main opposition party or the voters has positioned the main opposition party at the center. Not center right, not center left, literally at the center, because you basically see components of right, components of left in the narrative, in the policies, and in the choice of the candidates as well. But I think that's really and in a way, I read it as backlash from the voters against the incumbents' efforts to push the political landscape in Turkey to the far right, further and further. So voters are in a way like pulled it back to the center.
I mean, on some levels, it seemed as if Erdogan and the AKP were almost invincible. Certainly coming out of the elections in 2023. But now there are cracks in that, right? I mean, this is a significant setback for Erdogan and for the AKP. And so before we talk about some of the other characters that maybe we should all be watching and some of the other individuals, I'd be curious to hear from you how strong you think Erdogan's grip on power is after this election.
Can you repeat the last part? I didn't.
How strong Erdogan's grip on power is after these election results, or do you think that he's severely weakened in his role?
I think, I mean, he has 4 more years to rule, so I think it would be a little bit premature to believe that his grip on power is fading. I also don't see any dynamic within the party that is kind of questioning his role, which you might expect in a different country maybe, or in a different situation. But of course, as you said, his aura of shattered. Himself has conceded defeat and also said that his party is going to analyze its mistakes, correct its mistakes. And I think from Erdogan, we can expect that this is going to happen, that he is not shy to actually totally change course if he sees any advantage in it. And as we have seen today, for example, he limited trade with Israel, which since October he has been holding on to this policy of running trade with Israel normally, despite his anti-Israeli and Israel rhetoric. So I think this is already quite a step and a direct consequence of his defeat or his party's defeat in the election. And of course, a lot depends on in how far he's able to get the inflation under control. I think we can assume that he has a good team and he's willing to take the necessary steps. But the economic dynamic, I'm not an economist, but I believe has also its limits, because he's not willing to take the necessary steps in terms of rule of law. So we are not going to see, a return to 10, 15 years ago when Turkey was thriving and an attractive investment point for Western investors. And
I think, sorry.
Just one point, maybe. What I found very interesting is that Erdogan himself has said that one kind of weak spot of his party is its arrogance. And I think he's got a point there, that people now feel that this party that used to always criticize CHP, I mean the opposition party, as an elitist project, now has become, very detached and very much full of itself. So I found it quite an interesting move that actually, after he said this in an internal party meeting, he went to a coffee shop and was just sitting with the people. Of course, that was, kind of part of his propaganda, but it was still a smart move to show himself with normal people and kind of showing himself to be the first person to make this change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I may add to that quickly, I mean, I see actually 3 points. One is that obviously it is the presidential system where there are no checks, almost there are no checks and balances. So the executive has almost absolute power over the legislative and the judiciary. And that didn't change on Sunday. Therefore, he has quite of a grip on power. But second, what kind of building on what Friederike said, I think the election results seem to have triggered quite of a significant debate within the party, and now accentuating what you had said earlier, Stephen, these different camps within the party. And surprisingly, this morning, for instance, among some of the Islamist columnists, pro-government columnists, there is now a debate starting putting the presidential system into question. Mm-hmm. Because for some, for instance, presidential system is actually exactly one of the reasons why the party has lost touch with the citizens. And where that discussion would go, I don't know. But what I think will happen, because for Erdogan, it's difficult. If he moderates, it's a problem. If he goes the other way and increases repression, it's another problem. So for me, after Sunday's results, the system will be more unstable, and I think will be more crisis, kind of like dwelling in crises. And that is connected to the last point that I want to make. Now, losing a significant number of cities to the CHP, the party and Erdogan has also lost their resource base to maintain the clientelistic practices, which again would kind of like, it becomes a vicious cycle, because if you cannot, again, given the state of the economy as well, if you cannot channel resources to the citizens, then you are not going to be able to maintain your election machine. And if you cannot maintain your election machine, then you kind of like jeopardize, or it increases the risk of winning the election again. So there, I think it's really, it puts the system really in a more unstable path, in my opinion.
So somewhat unstable moving forward. And I mean, I guess, you know, each of you have drawn out a couple different sets of issues that are important to voters. Sinem, I think you were talking a little bit about security being an important factor for many people living in Turkey. Friederike, you were talking a little bit about some of the economic factors, the fact that pensioners might not have gone to vote because they are not able to get by financially, and that there's concern about that as well. I guess I'd be curious what you think in the near term Erdogan and his AKP party might do to try to shore up more support. Friederike, as you pointed out, he still has 4 more years in office. There's a lot that he can do, but it seems as if he needs to recover in short order and show some of his strengths. So do either of you have any thoughts or ideas about what his short to midterm policies might be to strengthen his position and that of the AKP?
That is a difficult question, I would say. And again, it also depends on who will get, I would say, the president's ear more within the party, because it seems to me that there are really now kind of like 2 camps emerging. On the one hand, one camp is kind of like pushing forward a substantive reform of the party, kind of going back to the earlier days of the party, revitalizing this conservative, moderate, or the Muslim Democratic Party days. And then on the other hand, there's another camp which I would define as more hawkish, so to speak. And that's kind of, it seems to me that the discussion in that camp is completely in a different realm. And of course, it also, I think, depends on, given that the party has kind of like lost its essence over the years and lost its also human base in terms of human capital, etc. It's very difficult. The way I see it is that it's not very easy for Erdogan to kind of move away from AKP's junior partner, the ultra-nationalist party. which again, like I think is a significant factor that's kind of like pushing the political landscape more to the far right, etc. So he's really not in a very good position, I would say. And to add to that, what I mentioned earlier, the unexpectedly high vote share that the Islamist New Welfare Party gained, that put the party in a more powerful bargaining position that would also put extra pressure on President Erdogan. I mean, none of these answers the question that you asked, because I don't have an answer to that question, what Erdogan would do. Yeah.
I'm afraid I also don't have an answer. Part of the reason is that Erdogan is really difficult to calculate. I mean, he usually does things that nobody has expected. One big question, I think, is that whether this court case against Imamoglu, which threatens him with a ban on politics, is going forward or not. I personally cannot imagine that Erdogan would play this card, because that would be too kind of simple. But a lot of people in the opposition are still fearing this kind of maneuvers. I think another. I would expect that Erdogan is rather playing a long game now, because he keeps on stressing that there are now 4 years without elections. I could imagine that he would take that a number of people will lose their jobs, to first of all show that something is going on in the party, show that, because it's important for him to show now that he has understood, that he's responding to kind of the vote and so on. But I simply don't know in which direction he's going to go. One issue that played quite a role before the election was the Kurdish question, and before the election there was a lot of kind of noise, or people saying that there might be a new peace process, or some kind of process that through which Erdogan might try to win back the Kurdish camp. But it doesn't look like this at all right now. He's rather going for a new military operation in Iraq, which would, again, kind of invigorate the nationalistic credentials.
Let's maybe talk a little bit about the opposition. You've both mentioned that the opposition is not completely united, that it's somewhat fragmented between the different parties that exist. And we've talked a little bit about the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem Imamoglu, who of course is possibly facing this court case. But coming out of this election, he seems to be sort of the main face of the opposition parties. What can you tell us about him? What should we know about Imamoglu?
Shall I go ahead? I mean, the first thing that I would say is that he definitely has a very strong political charisma. And I think he has proven himself again for the second, perhaps even the third time, if you also count the renewed election back in 2019. And he also seems to have the appeal of a very wide range of electorate across the political spectrum. So he is a kind of a uniting figure, so to speak. And I think he is also a good example for what I said earlier, that the voters kind of positioned CHP at the center. So he himself actually stands very much at the center. And he has been favored by the Kurds in Istanbul. He has been also, I think, liked by like the secularists, nationalists. So he has quite of a support from different groups of individuals. and combined with the political charisma he has, and of course, like after 22 years, I think one of the I mean, leadership has always been important, and I guess it's important in any political context, but it has been extra important in the Turkish political context. But I think 22 years of AKP rule, one of the legacies of that is the very idea of a redeemer. Mm-hmm. And I think people see that in the persona of İmamoğlu. And of course, what we talked earlier in terms of Erdogan turning this election into a national election, in a way kind of pitting his own candidate in Istanbul, who was backed by media, state resources, etc. It was a competition at the end of the day between İmamoğlu and the state apparatus. Yeah. And İmamoğlu won it. So I think that says something definitely for İmamoğlu's likelihood to be one of the possible candidates in the future elections. But 4 years is also quite of a long time, I would say, for Turkish politics, given that even a month is a long time in Turkish politics. So, yeah.
A lot can happen over the course of the next 4 years, that's for sure. Friederike, any insights onto sort of this opposition figure?
Yeah, first of all, you spoke about this opposition alliance, and I think it was almost a relief for İmamoğlu that he didn't have to deal with all these parties, because that was actually, in the end, a big minus in the presidential elections when voters started to question how is this government that has supposedly 7 vice presidents or a very complicated negotiation structure, how is that ever going to work? So the fact that he actually won the voters of the other parties without their open endorsement was a very good sign for him. And of course, we have seen one of those opposition parties, the İYİ party, almost collapse due to its kind of strategic maneuvers around the presidential election and now the local election. One factor which I think we will have to look at in the next 4 years is that Mansur Yavaş, because he won 60% of the votes in Ankara, he also might have a claim to presidential candidacy. So that's of course a risk for the opposition or for the CHP now, that there could be some kind of a leadership struggle at some point. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure, I think one point was not mentioned yet, that İmamoğlu is from the Black Sea region. I think that plays a very important role, because it gives his claim that he can also win over conservative voters much credibility.
So taking sort of a step back, I'm curious, Sinem, if you could tell us what the response has been from the Turkish community in Germany to these election results. Is that something that you've been following?
No, that's a good question, actually, which also didn't come to my mind. No, I didn't follow it, and I also haven't encountered actually much commentary about it, but I also didn't actively follow it.
Yeah. And Friederike, I mean, you've been reporting on what's going on in Turkey to a largely German audience. Have you picked up on any sort of response to these election results?
No, I haven't. The only thing that I can think of course, in this election, Turkish voters in Germany were not allowed to vote. So that also played a role in the I mean, that's also a big difference to the presidential election, where Erdogan could not get those votes from Germany. But I think one thing that is often forgotten when we look at Turkish people in Germany is that, of course, those people who are supporting the opposition, many of them have German citizenship and are not voting at all, or they don't have the same attachment to Turkey, so they wouldn't bother to vote. So I'm sure there were a lot of people happy in Germany with the Turkish background.
And so sticking sort of with this foreign policy dimension or international dimension, if you will, obviously, as both of you have said, I mean, Erdogan is in power for at least another 4 years. Many of the structures are in place for him to govern, despite some of the uncertainty that might exist in domestic politics. What do you think Europe, what do you think NATO can expect from Turkey, from Erdogan in the years ahead? Do you think Turkey will be a steadfast partner to Europe, to NATO? Do you think that that's something that might be called into question?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I think that in the coming couple of years, economy will be the priority of the incumbent government. And there, I think the expectation and the hope is to get financial flows running from the West. That, in addition to the new dynamics in the aftermath of October 7, and I think Ankara coming to the realization that after 2 decades of policy to position Turkey as a regional power in the Middle East, that it is not one, together with the dynamics triggered by the war in Ukraine, my feeling is that there is quite of a strong willingness in Ankara to mend ties with its Western allies. And I think they have also been working towards that. But that doesn't, of course, mean that Turkey will stop being opportunistic, Turkey will stop playing the so-called balancing act, etc., or all of this narrative about the strategic autonomy. I think they will stay at the discursive level. But in terms of practice, my feeling is that, again, because of the economic priorities, foreign policy realm will not be as confrontative as it was between 2016 and 20.
Friederike, do you have anything to add to that, or can I maybe add another?
Maybe just the fact that Erdogan is going to Washington in May. So
that's
obviously
exactly the direction I wanted to go in, was to say that it's been leaked that that Erdogan will travel to Washington and visit the U.S. president. And I'm curious if either of you have any thoughts on what to watch for at that meeting in early May.
I think, first of all, the fact that the meeting is happening at all is a big win for Erdogan. This is something that he's been pushing for in the package of, how do you say, agreeing to Sweden's accession. I think one big question for Turkey is the U.S. presence in Syria and in how far there will be a drawdown, especially if there will be a change in the administration in Washington. I think that he's expecting to get a more positive reception than he might get in European capitals, because there is a bit less emotional energy, maybe. And then, yeah, I think one of the other questions that where there might be a bit of movement is this question of the fighter jet F-35, where Turkey might hope to be eventually re-invited into the program if they are willing to make some concessions, kind of not using air defense system. I think these are some of the topics on the agenda.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think particularly those questions around defense and inventory will be high on the agenda when those conversations between Biden and Erdogan take place. And it could be, you know, as Sinem was talking about, sort of part of that path to shore up the relationship with Western allies again. So I'm very curious to see how those conversations go. Sinem, did you have anything to add to what to watch when Erdogan is in Washington?
I mean, definitely defense cooperation, and there has already been news about possible cooperation in ammunition production. I think a Turkish company is actually already planting a company in Texas to produce ammunition to go to Ukraine, basically. But in addition to that, I think Iraq and Syria might also be one of the items, because the way I see it is that Ankara is clearly trying to kind of convince, at least get the US on its side again against the backdrop of the dynamics revealed after October 7, keyword Iran, and kind of position itself, particularly in Iraq. And I think that's also the background to this whole talk about the possible military operation in Iraq, kind of like to position Ankara in Iraq against Iran. And that's kind of like in a way, what Ankara puts on the table in negotiations with the US. So I can imagine that could also be one of the topics that they might be talking about.
And that's actually a question that just came in from one of our viewers who's curious to what degree Turkey coordinates with the United States, given that the US has troops on the ground in Iraq and in Syria, and the degree to which Turkey sort of keeps an eye on developments in Iran and informs the US about that. So I think you're right that these are issues that are undoubtedly going to be on the table when Erdogan visits Washington early next month. Well, obviously, lots to watch, lots to look at when it comes to Turkish politics and the impact of those domestic politics on Turkey's foreign policy, but also on its relations with other countries. But I would like to just thank both of you for taking the time to join us as part of our Superwahljahr 2024 or Super Election Year 2024 series, where we are unpacking some of the insights and some of the details of various elections that are taking place around the world this year. This has been a really interesting and informative conversation. I've certainly learned a lot, and I really appreciate both of you taking the time and joining us today.
Thank you, Stephen, for the invitation.
Thank you.